Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sheryl Benedict, a principal consultant with Foregenix.
I'm Carlos Marquez, senior penetration tester for Foregenix as well.
So today, we're just going to go ahead and take a look at scoping of pen testing. Itself requires accurate information, knowledge of the customer expectations, including customer compliance requirements, the technical deployments, as well as specific technologies. We will go through and review some of those basic concepts. Then, with the help of real-world examples, we'll discuss those top 10 challenges of scoping penetration tests in the cloud to help reduce the number of issues that may arise. The goal is to help ensure that the penetration tests are scoped and are effective.
And why did we choose this topic? Basically, during the last year, several customers asked us to pen test environments that were described with a lot of technical verbiage. You may know some of those: Lambda, DynamoDB, Cosmos, Kubernetes, S3, blobs, etc. So these new scenarios require a change in the scoping question and information to be gathered prior of the engagement, as well as adding some new pen testing techniques to be considered along the execution of the cloud test, or the cloud pen test.
So going through what is in the cloud can be very intimidating, but you're going to find the contents and the concepts are very familiar to each other. The cloud environments include almost everything that you would find in a traditional environment, on-premise, but it's just virtual. So going through this technology architecture is different, however, but the PCI DS controls requirements apply just the same. So looking at assessing and scoping of cloud services, what you're going to find is you've got master accounts and subscriptions. You'll have most likely a primary account and also sub-accounts within your subscription, like within Azure or Amazon. Confirmation and validation of the scope must be performed by the merchant or service provider prior to the PCI DSS assessment, and your assessor will go through and confirm the scope of the assessment, and then again, apply any scope reduction if applicable. PCI DSS version 3.2.1 should validate the scope annually, and with PCI DSS version 4, requirement 12.5.2, this is now a new requirement. So going through the core penetration test scope concepts, you're going to find in this chart here is the example of the responsibility assignments for the management of controls within infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, etc. So PCI technical testing applies to most of these scenarios. The scope of the testing should include those systems and applications that store, process, or transmit card data.
As indicated in requirements 6 and 11 of PCI DSS, a penetration testing could be performed against either an internal or an external network, an application, or against segmentation controls if those are implemented. It's important to remember that the penetration testing should be conducted as defined by the rules of the engagement agreed upon by both parties. Before the cloud, we used to consider each CDE system as a unit, as a unique system. But nowadays, with the cloud, we should consider additional components for an application or a system. And those components may vary depending on the vendor and the technology and how it has been implemented. Well, we are going to bring you today 10 challenges that we have found while scoping real penetration testing projects in the cloud. The challenge includes the consideration of aspects like the change in the rules of the engagement, also how to identify targets, and defining the optimal cloud testing scenarios, as well as adding additional activities that were not performed usually while we are testing on-premise systems. Nowadays, each cloud provider, Amazon Web Service, Google Cloud Platform, and Azure offer hundreds of services, and each of those services are named with its own marketing terminology. It resembles a little bit the Tower of Babel, isn't it? So our first advice and our first lesson learned was being aware about the service equivalences between those providers. There are several ways to do that. Usually, a useful tool is one provided by Google Cloud that usually compare the big players. But however, there are another public sources that consider all other players that includes Oracle, Alibaba, or Huawei. Also, during the scoping, it's important to identify each system or each application along with the cloud service that supports it. Why is this important? Let's imagine a content delivery network or a load balancer that is in front of an application system and is allowing access to this service through the internet. The tester should be aware to distinguish between the application of the customer and the infrastructure of the cloud service provider.
It is key to know what cloud implementation model and the responsibilities apply here. So taking a look at pen testing within the third-party infrastructure, testing in the cloud might require some unexpected limitations for pen testing. For example, organizations do not want to have a disruption in their environment. However, they want their pen testers to go easy on them. Keep in mind that a real hacker will not hold back, and your pen tester is there to help identify how easy or how difficult it is to break into your environment. Organizations can help set up test infrastructures that can be then tested in a no-holds-barred manner. That way, your production infrastructure remains untouched. So going through and looking at confirming of the third-party service provider terms and conditions, and of course, those support policies that go along with their contracts for conducting a penetration test against the environment.
Note that these third-party service provider terms impact the rules of the engagement of the pen testing. Let's see some real scenarios. For example, if you are doing a pen test in Azure, Azure's limiting the exploitation to a proof of concept. For example, is acceptable to demonstrate that you have sysadmin by using a SQL injection, but it's not acceptable to execute commands in the backend database service, for example, running XP CMD shell. Also, another reference is that Amazon Web Service lists which services cannot be tested, so this should be excluded of the scope of the test. And also, we know that all of the cloud providers forgive and restrict the phishing attack, the possibility to performing phishing attack against their employees. However, it's important to know that a real attacker doesn't have this limitation, but anyway, this is another conversation.
So going through and looking at the inaccurate inventory, network diagrams, and data flows, this issue is not only exclusive to cloud environments. You'll note that this issue applies into a standard environment as well. So going through, you need to ensure that you have accurate system inventories that make sure that they are aligned with your network diagrams and data flows. You'll want to go through and confirm against the PCI responsibility matrices and identify and understand who is responsible for what.
Practical approaches to validate the scope could include checking previous pen test reports or vulnerability reports, if those are available. And also, it's highly advised to use programmatic or automated inventory report tools to list all the cloud assets that will be included in the pen test.
Taking a look at the CDE boundaries. Before, most of those segmentation controls were based off network controls. However, the cloud technologies will enforce new concepts that can be deployed. You want to go through and confirm those segmentation controls in use and identify and understand which OSI layer is the control applied to. For example, network security groups, etc. What could be the most effective testing strategies to be applied for this scenario?
Talking about boundaries, let's imagine multiple Docker, maybe containerd, or Windows Server containers running in a system. As the isolation in this architecture is based on the process, all containers share multiple resources, and this architecture does not provide adequate segmentation for a high-security environment. So an architecture review makes a lot of sense to identify how these boundaries are set, and this information is definitely an input for the scoping test.
Taking a look at the hidden connections, there are so many areas to look at here. You want to go through and look at your redundancy systems, looking at all your backups that might be existing in the environment. You've also got jump boxes. You also have additional services such as your web application firewall, IDS, IPS, load balancers, and your API gateways. You also have CI/CD pipeline components, which also includes your automation and other system dependencies. You'll also note that you've got VPCs that can be connected to other VPCs, including VPCs and other accounts by enforcement of these peering connections.
Okay, talking about virtual environments, in the cloud, it usually makes sense to assume low-privilege internal compromise scenarios. Why? Because usually in an internal pen test, it is required to deploy a VPC into the internal network or maybe provide to the tester access to a jump box. A logical a logical attack vector that can be tested is query metadata from the console from the virtual machine. At this point, this attack vector can only be performed if you are already into the environment. And talking about missing documentation about APIs and applications, first note that this issue is not only exclusive to cloud environment. It has been happening forever. In the case of application and web testing, maybe the black box is not always the best approach because sometimes some functionalities of the application or maybe some endpoints may be missed from the point of view of the tester. So about this specific test, it's important to ask about technical documentation using any format, either Postman or OpenAPI collections, or also request an API endpoint list, or also ask, for example, for the list for valid requests, so you can identify the format of those requests as a tester and identify how to interact with the application. Also, having some business contacts is really recommended. Finally, it's important to remember that classic attack vectors are still valid in cloud pen testing. Any injection attack, insecure direct object references, and a special mention, of course, for server-side request forgery has been present in several attacks, for example, the one against Capital One in 2019.
So taking a look at containers and microservices, what parts of a containerized environment are out of scope is especially challenging when running both in-scope and out-of-scope workloads within the same infrastructure. Proving that the unrelated workloads cannot impact the security of the cardholder data environment might be particularly challenging.
Okay, talking about containers and microservices, before we talk on architecture review. This architecture review usually should reveal how the orchestration is managed. Also, it's important to check if any API or any user management interface is exposed and make sure that the authentication for those managed points is included in the pen test. Also, it's very important to check if secrets and any other sensitive information may be present, may be hard coded in the container or the orchestration configuration files. Note that this is an additional task that is not to be performed while testing on-premises systems.
One also key thing to point here is taking a look at the special interest group and taking a look at the guidance for containers and container orchestration tools. This was recently published in September of 2022. Foregenix has contributed to this special interest group along with several other industry professionals and provides a lot more information and detailed documentation on this.
Talking about serverless infrastructure, let's imagine an implementation in Amazon Web Service that calls a Lambda function if a specific event occurs. To be able to test this architecture, this environment, the tester first should have knowledge of the application logic and also needs to have the ability of invoking the function. It may require, for example, a script to call the Lambda function, and of course, access to the Amazon Web Service shell or maybe the console in order to be able to trigger this scenario. So it worth mentioning that you cannot pen test what you don't see.
Great point there. So taking a look at what you'll need to know here is distinguishing between the cloud infrastructure as well as those application components. It means that the knowledge of the application architecture and the responsibility matrix becomes key here.
Well, and Finally, the cloud adds additional scenarios that may be required to be tested. For example, an enumeration of the cloud services and what is exposed to the public may be required by using open source intelligent resources and also a deep exploration of the whole attack surface. Let's imagine, for example, a web application that loads content from an S3 bucket. If this bucket is writable, or if this bucket is dead, there are additional threats and additional attacks that can be executed. For example, domain hijacking that may lead to compromise the application or poisoning the content of the application itself. Also, an additional test is checking for privilege escalation vector attacks in the cloud. For example, starting from reader and try to become contributor or maybe owner in an Azure implementation.
One other thing here to note is to identify the software repositories as well as auditing against them. This will help prevent a future breach, such as Uber in 2016 and 2022. As you note from those breaches, they had compromised sensitive information and with the Amazon credentials that were stored in that private GitHub repository. So again, look at those software repositories and audit against them. In summary, the organization being assessed is responsible for identifying the CDE and any critical systems. Confirmation and the validation of scope would be required prior to the assessment, which is a new requirement. You'll want to work with your pen tester and assessor to verify and confirm your scope and to ensure that there are no system components that are overlooked. You also want to understand what cloud service provider model is utilized, and then again, examine those responsibility matrices.
And remember, you can pen test what you don't see. A correct scoping effort may help to reveal hidden spots. So also, additional tasks may be added to the cloud pen test, for example, an external reconnaissance task, or also auditing software repository reviews is definitely something that needs to be done.
So in conclusion, thank you very much for joining with us today. On behalf of myself, Sheryl, Benedict, and Carlos Marquez, feel free to join us after the booth, Foregenix booth, here after our talk, if you have any additional questions or want to meet the rest of our team. Appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.